I want us to watch a short video. Hear now the word of the Lord taken from the Gospel of St. John, chapter 11, beginning with verse 17. And those of you who don't mind standing for the reading of the word of God, we ask that you'll stand. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, Son of God, who is to come into the world." After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here and is asking for you." Mary heard this. She got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out. They followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Thus far, the word of the Lord. You may be seated. When Jesus saw her, being Mary, weeping, the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. I want to preach from that 2-word verse. Jesus wept. The past 8 days have been ones of extreme horror and sadness for many. Last Saturday night at the Star Ballroom in Monterey, California, a 72-year-old gunman opened fire, shooting 42 rounds, which killed 11 people. On last Monday in Half Moon Bay, California, a 66-year-old gunman shot 4 people at the mushroom farm where he worked and drove to another farm and killed 3 people. Hours after that, in Oakland, California, a targeted shooting involving multiple shooters killed one person and wounded 7 others. On Friday evening, the videotape of the officer-involved beating and killing of Tyree Nichols was released to the absolute horror of all who viewed it. And then on yesterday, 3 people were killed and 4 others wounded in a shooting at a multi-million-dollar home in Los Angeles, California. Each of these incidents represents families, friends, neighbors, co-workers, neighborhoods, workplaces, and cities suffering immense trauma and grief. Worlds have been turned inside out and upside down. The intensity of the pain is heightened by the seeming randomness and nonsensicalness of the losses. What rhyme or reason could be appropriate for such deaths and loss? What words could ever be adequate to meet such moments? It is in such moments that questions are raised. How could this happen? More personally, how could this happen to me and mine? How could God let this happen? Where is God? What is God doing? Does God know what I'm thinking and feeling? Who can feel me in the depth of pain that I'm in? Who can get the mixture of anguish and grief that I'm experiencing? Does God get me where I am in my grief, in my sorrow, in my anger, in my despair, in my heartache? Does God feel me? And if so, where in the world is he? The text before us gives us an answer. It's contained in the shortest verse in the Bible, made up of 2 words: Jesus wept. Jesus gets our tears, our grief, our sadness, our sorrows. Jesus wept. The context of these 2 words are that of the death and burial of Lazarus, a dear friend of Jesus. Some 7 days prior, Jesus received word from Lazarus' sister, Mary and Martha, that Lazarus was gravely ill. Behind that email, behind that tweet, was a request for him to come and heal Lazarus of his sickness. Contrary to their expectations, Jesus remained where he was. Jesus did not send a word of healing in Lazarus' direction. Jesus did not deputize the disciples with power to go and lay their hands on him. Jesus actually does nothing. Subsequently, Lazarus died and was buried. And by the time of Jesus' arrival, Lazarus had been dead and buried for 4 days. Upon hearing of Jesus' arrival, Martha goes to where Jesus is with the words, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus assures her of Lazarus' resurrection, to which she assents to her belief in the resurrection of the dead at the last day. And it is then that Jesus reveals, no, I am the resurrection and the life. And he that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live, and whoever liveth and believeth in me shall not surely die. Do you believe this? And she says, I believe that you are the Messiah come into the world. He corrects her by letting her know resurrection is not simply a belief. It is a living reality with his presence. He is resurrection, and he is life. Martha runs and tells Mary that Jesus has arrived and he is looking for her. Mary approached Jesus weeping and uttering the same words as Martha. And then John writes, seeing Mary weeping and the others weeping, Jesus is deeply moved in spirit and troubled. he requests Lazarus' location, to which Mary and the others say, "Come and see." And it is then that we receive the words, Jesus wept. It is something that the shortest verse in the Bible is one describing a sublime truth of Jesus. So much is being said in these two words, Jesus wept. It is John who gives us this account and these words. John who sets forth that Jesus is the Word that was in the beginning with God, and that was God, and by whom all things were made, and without whom was not anything was made that was made. It is John who tells us that in Jesus was light, and the light was the life of men, and that light shines in the darkness, and the darkness could not prevail against it. And this Jesus wept. This Jesus, who was before anything else was, and is the reason and power by which all things are upheld, that Jesus wept. The Jesus who rescued a wedding reception embarrassment by turning water into wine, who cast out demons, who healed blind people at pools, who caused the lame to pick up their beds and walk, who fed multitudes with a small lunch, who calmed seas and walked on water, twice raised the dead. This Jesus wept. This demon-defeating, disease-healing, death-defying, water-walking, storm-calming Jesus. That Jesus wept. What should we get from Jesus weeping? What does it mean when you say Jesus gets weeping and Jesus gets tears? First of all, Jesus weeps as an expression of his humanity. Jesus comes to us as the Word made flesh. He takes our form upon himself. He is made like unto us. Jesus does not come as a hologram. He does not come as an AI. He's not an avatar in virtual reality. No, Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary. He was born with flesh and blood. While he was all God, he was also all human. And his divinity did not shield him from his humanity. There was no gate, there was no wall, there was no barrier that protected him from the human experience. He hungered as a man. He thirsted as a man. He grew tired as a man. He was tempted as a man. He suffered distress as a man. Verse 33 reads, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Those words here describe an intense agitation, an inner turmoil, a stirring up, a disturbance, and unsettling. Jesus is not kept from the experience of distress, of agitation, of turmoil, of being unsettled. Jesus experiences all of that. And what's important is that the words used by John to describe Jesus are the same words used to describe Zechariah in Luke chapter 1, used to describe Herod in Matthew chapter 2, used to describe the disciples in Mark chapter 6. Jesus' weeping is the expression of his humanity. He weeps in response to his being troubled, agitated, disturbed, grieved, saddened, and angered. And as such, he reveals to us what full humanity is. He demonstrates a whole masculinity that feels deeply and responds openly. As he stood there in the midst of loss, he's torn. As he stands there in the midst of, whenever John uses the words, the Jews, he is speaking of those who were active in their opposition to Jesus. When he sees them weeping, he's torn. There's internal commotion within him, and he was not afraid to be seen weeping. You see, friends, the denial of tears is a denial of our humanity. God created us to cry. He created us with tear glands that secrete tears and tear ducts whose sole purpose is the release of tears. God so wired our neurological system such that when we reach points of sorrow, distress, anger, or even joy, our limbic system, the part of the brain that involves emotional arousal, signals our pons, which is the brain's message center, which then sends a signal to the tear glands to produce emotional tears, whose chemistry is different from basal and reflex tears, which are found in other animals to lubricate the eyes. That's basal tears, and reflex tears to wash away irritants. But emotional tears are tears of a different sort. They have proteins and hormones not found in basal and reflex tears. There are higher levels of prolactin and adrenocorticotropic hormones, that is related to adrenaline and cortisone, potassium and manganese. In other words, I just want you to know, chemically wise, God so wired and designed us such that when we are met by certain experiences of stress and pressure, discomfort, distress, sorrow, grief, or even joy, we naturally respond with tears. And the denial, the avoidance, the stifling of tears is the denial and avoidance and the stifling of our humanity. We are rejecting a critical part of what it means to be human. We are rejecting something that distinguishes us from other animals. Jesus wept. The strongest man to ever walk the planet wept. And what that lets us know is strong men cry. Real men cry. Secure men cry. 1 Samuel chapter 30 speaks of David and the men who were with him in response to their city being burned with fire and their women and children taken, weeping until they had no more strength to weep. In 2 Samuel 15 and 30, as David retreats from his son Absalom's rebellion, it is said that David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went, barefoot and with his head covered. Real men cry, strong men cry, secure men cry. And I just need to ask them, where are the real men? Where are the secure men? Where are the strong men who know what I'm talking about? Where are the tough and tender men? You're not a robot. You're not an automaton. You're not an android. You're not a golem. You're not weak. You're not a wimp. You're not a wuss. You're a real flesh and blood man. You're a Jesus man. And Jesus men weep. In sorrow over the loss of loved ones, you'll cry. In remorse over your sin, you'll cry. In anger over the senseless deaths in California and the brutality of police officers toward Tyree Nichols, you'll cry. In joy, you'll cry. In pride of a loved one's accomplishments, you'll cry. At the thought of the Lord's goodness to you in gratitude, you'll cry. When you think about how far the Lord has brought you, what the Lord has enabled you to overcome, the prayers that the Lord has answered, the battles that the Lord has fought, the victories that the Lord has won, the healing that the Lord has provided, the deliverance that the Lord has wrought, how God has kept your children, tears will flow. Let the real men say something right now. Real men. Jesus men cry. Jesus gets our humanity. Jesus wept. But then also Jesus weeps in identification and association with the sorrows of others. Notice the flow of the text. Jesus has absorbed the disappointment and distress of Martha and Mary communicated by their statement, "If you had been here, our brother would not have died." He then saw Mary weeping. Others came beside her weeping. It is then that Jesus is deeply moved and troubled and weeps. The context of his weeping is in part the weeping of those for whom he cared. He loved Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. They were dear friends of his. He could stop by their house unannounced and have a place to lay his head and food for his stomach. He is touched by their grief and their sorrow. And it is in response to what he feels for them that he weeps. He identifies with their sorrow, their distress, their pain. He associates with them. He is in fellowship and solidarity with them. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus is revealed as identifying and feeling the state of others. It is often signaled by the words, "moved with compassion." He had compassion on them. Jesus felt what people felt in the depths and particularities of their feeling. He was pained by their pain. He was disturbed by their disturbance. He was troubled by their troubles. He was grieved by their grief. Jesus gets our tears. Jesus gets our having had it up to here. He gets our being at the point of not being able to take anything else. He gets the heart being torn and broken. He gets the mind being overloaded. Jesus gets the heart being overwhelmed. Jesus gets our crying ourselves to sleep and waking up with tears. He gets our wondering, will there ever be a day when we don't feel like the way that we feel? He is touched with the feeling of our infirmities. He is moved and he is stirred when nobody else feels you, when nobody can feel you. He feels you. He is touched. If I were in California right now or in Memphis and somebody would ask me, where is Jesus? In the midst of this mayhem and wreckage and rubble, in the midst of my emotional upheaval and turmoil, where is Jesus? My answer would be, he's right there with you. He weeps as you weep. He sighs as you sigh. He is torn as you are torn. He feels everything that you are feeling, and what you don't have a name for it, he already knows its name. David testifies in Psalm 34:18, the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. I wonder, is there anybody glad that the Lord identifies with you and what you feel and what you experience? Our God is not some far-off God that is detached from us and untouched by us. No, we have a God. We have a Savior who is touched by us. We have a Savior who dwells and sits with us and tarries with us and groans with us and cries with us, and in whose feeling with us provides mercy, provides grace to help in time of need. And as he feels what we feel, he supplies what we need as we need. The God who sits with us is the God who stays with us, and he's the God who sustains us, who holds us, who keeps us, who hears our cries, who pities our groan, who dries our tears, who gets us up out of bed, empowers us to face the days, the weeks, the months, and the years that follow. Jesus sits right where you are, and he stays right there with you. He feels everything that you are feeling, and yes, he weeps as you weep. Jesus wept. Jesus gets our tears. He gets our weeping. He expresses his humanity. He associates with our sorrows. But there's something else. There's something else there. Jesus weeps, fully knowing that the worst is not the end. Now, you got to remember the flow of these events. Jesus received word of Lazarus' sickness. Jesus tells the disciples it would not end in death. It is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. And then after 2 days of staying right where he was, Jesus tells the disciples that he is going to awaken Lazarus. And the disciples say, well, if he's asleep, we don't need to go there. But Jesus has to clarify to let them know, no. Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Now, wait a minute. Mary and Martha are the ones who sent him the email. Mary and Martha are the ones who are Lazarus' sisters. And Jesus says he's dead. And for not Mary and Martha's sake, but for the disciples' sake, Jesus says, I'm glad I wasn't there. Now, wait a minute. I got some problems with this. It's Mary and Martha who are Lazarus' sisters. They're the ones who sent the email to Jesus. They're the ones who are experiencing Lazarus dying and now Lazarus being buried. And Jesus says, not for their sake, but for the disciples' sake, he's glad that he wasn't there. What kind of Jesus says something like this? What kind of Jesus will allow Mary and Martha to go through the emotional turmoil that they're going through, and Jesus says, for somebody else's sake, he's glad that he wasn't there. It's the type of Jesus who says, I'm glad I wasn't there in their worst, because I know that their worst is not the end. And I can trust who I am on their behalf to show something to somebody else about what I can do. Lord have mercy. In response to Martha, Jesus says, your brother will rise again. I'm the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Jesus says, I know the worst is not the end. But Jesus, having said what he said, when Jesus arrives and experiences what he experiences, Jesus wept. Jesus' weeping was not that of resignation, was not that of capitulation. Jesus weeps in the midst of knowing that death is not the end. He told the disciples this would not end in death. Tell your neighbor, you got to read. He did not say that it would not include death. He said it would not end in death. Lazarus would die, but death would not be the end. And Jesus wept in the midst of the worst, knowing that the worst would not be the end, that there was resurrection after death. He wept knowing that with him it wasn't over. And that's why after he wept, he went to the tomb. After he wept, he said, take away the stone. After he wept, he said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you'll see the glory of God? After he wept, Father, I thank you that you've heard me, and I know that you always hear me. But I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. After he wept, he said, Lazarus, come forth. After he wept, he told the people, take off the grave clothes and let him go. After he wept, Lazarus came forth walking, like Aretha Franklin said, like a natural man. Jesus wept, knowing that the worst was not the end. There is resurrection with Jesus. And friends, what Jesus demonstrates is we are able to weep in the worst, knowing that the worst is not the end. That's what Jesus told the disciples in John chapter 16, verses 19 through 22. Jesus saw that they wanted to ask him about this. So he said, are you asking one another what I meant when I said, in a little while you will see me no more, and then after a little while you will see me? Very truly I tell you, you will weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy. A woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come, but when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of her joy that a child is born into the world. So with you, now is your time of grief, but I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and nobody will take away your joy. And sure enough, the worst came with their grief, because later that evening, with Jesus being betrayed by Judas, Peter denies Jesus 3 times. And when the rooster crowed, Matthew writes of Peter in Matthew 26, and he went out and wept bitterly. The worst came that Friday with Jesus being crucified on the cross at Calvary. The worst came as the darkness covered the earth between the 6th and the 9th hour, when Jesus felt forsaken of God and cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? The worst came when Jesus gave up the ghost. The worst came as they laid his lifeless body into Joseph's tomb and saw it covered with a stone and guarded by Roman soldiers. They wept in the worst Friday and Saturday, but early Sunday morning, God raised Jesus from the dead with all power in his hands. And when they arrived at the tomb, they found it empty and received the message that Jesus is risen. And that evening, with them being shut up in the upper room because they were afraid of the Jews, Jesus came into the room, spoke peace unto them. And John writes, then were the disciples glad when they saw the Lord. Then was their grief turned into joy. With his resurrection, life came after death, and light came after darkness, and joy came after sorrow. Jesus gets our tears, and with Jesus, we get the hope of knowing that our weeping in the worst is not the end. Yes, we weep, and yes, we grieve, and yes, we sorrow, and yes, it's dark, and yes, it's hurt, but the worst is not the end, because with Jesus, we have resurrection. We have what comes after the worst. After we fall, he renews our strength, causes us to mount up on wings as eagles, run and not get weary, walk and not faint. After our weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. Suffering is not the end, because Peter writes in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 10, after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore you and establish you and strengthen you. I don't know how anybody else feels, but I'm glad that Jesus gets my tears, and I get his tears. Lord have mercy. He gets my tears, and I get his tears. In other words, I can weep knowing that the worst is not the end, and I can testify for myself that the worst has not been the end. I faced what I thought was the worst, but the worst was not the end. I wept and I still weep, but I weep knowing that the worst is not the end. I weep knowing that there is resurrection, that there is a better day, that there is another day. And I don't believe I'm by myself. I believe I'm looking at some people. I believe I'm talking to some people who are worshiping virtually, who can testify you experienced the worst. You cried in the worst. You wept in the worst. My God, you did not think that you'd be able to see another day, did not want to face another week, but your testimony is the worst was not the end. The Lord gave you another day. The Lord gave you another week. The Lord gave you another month. The Lord has given you another year, and you're able to testify, yes, weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. Worse is not the end. He has the last say. And always he comes out a winner at the finishing line. He gets our tears. He gets when we're overwhelmed. He gets when we are anguished. He gets when we are perturbed. And because he gets us, we're able to intone these words, when my heart is overwhelmed.